Hi, my name is Catherine Coleman Flowers. I'm the founding director of the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice. Our focus is on sanitation equity throughout America because a lot of people are living without adequate sanitation. Well, initially, I started out doing economic development for Lowndes County, Alabama. But it was very hard to do because without adequate infrastructure, it's hard to attract businesses to an area. And I had bought into the belief that with economic development comes prosperity for everyone. And that was how we could lift people out of poverty. And in the process of doing this economic development, I found out that all things were not equal. And if the infrastructure is not equal, you certainly are not going to attract the type of businesses that can provide good paying jobs for people living in those communities that would allow them to so-called lift themselves out of poverty. And in that process, we also discovered that people in Lowndes County, Alabama, did not have adequate wastewater treatment. And as a result, were being arrested because they could not afford on-site sanitation. That's how I got involved. That led to my work in sanitation. That was in 2002 up to this point, and our founding of the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice. I think that what we did was educate the policymakers about what was happening in rural America, that this issue was not just a Lowndes County issue or an issue of race. If you live in rural America, there has not been the type of focus and attention on sanitation. People are more focused on big cities. And as a result, it impacts everyone. And I think that there were two moments that I think impacted our work. One was Flint, because Flint was about not being able to drink the water. So people start looking at water differently across this country. But the other part of that is not having a toilet that can flush and once it goes into the ground, not think about it anymore. That those were, I think that was one of the things that happened that made our movement grow bigger. Then of course, as time went on, and then we realized that people across the United States were having the same problem. It's not that the system wasn't what that people couldn't afford the systems were not working properly. Then, of course, COVID came along. And when COVID came along, it helped us to understand public health and how it's connected to not only sanitation, but if what we've been told is true, that it started because of the slaughtering of certain types of wildlife, what happens when we have sewage on the ground? And it made us look at our history in terms of pandemics and epidemics in this country and how it's not contained in one area. And if we don't address these issues, we can have bigger issues. And it could start right here in the United States as opposed to somewhere else and end up coming to our shores. I think that when I knew we had struck a nerve and had reached a milestone was when I was invited to the White House to introduce the president in the Rose Garden. And we talked about sanitation and the raw sewage issue in Lowndes County. And that was when I know we had reached what I thought was the zenith. But there were other moments along the way. One of the moments along the way, of course, was he actually sent Michael Regan, and he ultimately sent the Secretary of Agriculture there and also his infrastructure czar to Lowndes County. Those were milestones. And then to replicate this to rural communities across the country was a milestone. For even when DOJ decided that they were going to investigate our complaint and they negotiated a settlement with the Alabama Department of Public Health. That was a milestone because that was the first time they'd ever used civil rights law to address environmental justice issues. Well, the inspiration hit me sometime before, but I didn't know whether people would be interested in my story. Someone reached out to me actually and connected me to an editor. There were two people that reached out to me. One of the persons that reached out to me was Paul Farmer. who is now passed away, but he reached out to me and he had spoken to a publisher who was interested in me writing a book. And then the other person that reached out to me was a friend that I had met through a journalist who connected me to people at the New Press. And I decided to go with the New Press because they allowed me the freedom to just create um, and write from my heart. And I thought that this was a book that I just needed to write about what brought me to this, because people are always asking me, how did you get involved in this? And I felt like I need to tell the story. And the story didn't start with me. It actually started with my parents and the history of the civil rights movement in Lowndes County, which propelled and prepared me for what I was doing. So that was how Waste came about. So Waste is autobiographical, but it also talks about how being a part of a community that believed in the right to vote and advocacy prepared me to advocate for those people who could not advocate for themselves. I wanted people to think. I was hoping that this would come out before the election, hence my first essay, which was entitled 30 Pieces of Silver, and it talked about Judas. And I knew that I could see that there was more appeal to people that came from a Christian faith, and I felt this was an opportunity for me to uh, to really stand on my Christian faith and show how my experiences as well as my work was intertwined with my faith. And I felt that that was a way to connect and reach common ground with folk in the US that may have been told something different. There were lots of moments. One of the moments that I really fought to have in the book was to talk about the city of Huntsville when I talked about my moonshot. The city of Huntsville has a very interesting history. When we think about Huntsville, Alabama, for those that do know Huntsville, they think about the space program, but they don't think about Vanna von Braun, and they don't think about the fact that a lot of the people that were settled in Huntsville after World War II came from Germany. And that Vanna von Braun, who had served Hitler and had created the missiles that rained down on Europe, but also was the person who was one of the founders of the space program here for the United States, because the space program was founded here at the Redstone Arsenal here in Huntsville, Alabama. And von Braun lived here. And a lot of the scientists that had served in Germany lived here as well. And I thought that history was so compelling because when you look at him when he came to the US, one of the things he did, because that whole chapter, really a lot of it was about transformation, because he recruited Black scientists and engineers from HBCUs. Not only did he do that, but he stood up to George Wallace, who wanted to use his program as a backdrop to talk about segregation, and he would have none of it. So I just felt that that to talk about how people can sometimes reconcile, or at least attempt to reconcile and transform, I thought that was a good story to tell. and and I guess the point I was trying to make is just because you made a mistake don't mean that you have to continue to do it. In terms of climate change, I'm big into genealogy. So I use my own genealogy to tell climate stories, because a lot of the places that show up in my genealogy where I have at least one grandparent, great grandparent, great great grandparent, that's in that has contributed to my DNA, they're facing a climate crisis. And one of the stories I told was about being at COP 21 in Paris, and how Paris seemed so familiar to me, like I had been there before, although I had not. And at that same time, I received an email from a relative that was in Nova Scotia, that was a DNA relative, who told me the story of how we came to be related because of being descended from French fur trappers who had received a grant of land, and they had married Indian women, and they were the original Cajuns. So at that point, uh, I felt like it was a way to reach out and bridge some gaps around race being a social construct. Looking at Jackson, see that was another interesting story because I was in Jackson, Mississippi, and while I was there at the airport, when I flew into Jackson, I ran into the mayor of Jackson. And when I ran into the mayor, I told him that I was there for a conference, but also I was going to go out into the community because I wanted to understand the water issue in Jackson. And what he said to me was, when you look at Jackson as this is what happened when there's disinvestment. So it appeared that this capital city of Mississippi uh, was suffering because of the lack of investment, because who had the power in the city? And at that point, Jackson's population was, as you know, majority African American. And when I went through Jackson, looking at everything and thinking about the history, I decided to put the pen to paper, and that's how I ended up writing that essay about Jackson. But the next day after leaving Jackson, I went to Dubai. And it really made it a lot more intense for me in terms of what the possibilities are and how we sometimes cut off our noses to spite our faces. When you look at Dubai and all the things that we thought were not possible, you can see it in that city. And when you look at Jackson, all the things that are possible, we don't see it there because of the lack of investment. I think that it's always a theme throughout when we talk about not being able to address necessities, especially in waste more so than in holy ground, is the inability to be able to provide for one's needs and well-being because of the lack of opportunity. Or if they're sick, because they are unable to work. A lot of people in Lowndes County, for example, are getting disability because they're unable to work. And could it be because of environmental exposures? Nobody has ever really addressed that. And but I have heard we've talked to people and still talk to people, whether they're in East Palestine, Ohio, which is one of the places we visited, as well as in Alabama, Lowndes County, the power bills get so high because we have these changes in weather where if you're in a trailer, which is all electric and not as well insulated, and not certainly not built in a sustainable way, and especially the older homes, and your power bill goes up because you got to run the air conditioning all the time because we have more hot days, or when the bill gets high in the wintertime, when we're having these extreme weather events. For an example, where I live in the Huntsville, Alabama area, where we have temperatures that won't get above freezing for a week. And when that happens, we have rolling blackouts, but the power bill doesn't go down as a result. So a lot of times people have to make a choice between, I've heard people say to me, Catherine, I have to make a choice between whether I pay this bill or whether I eat. We just heard the same thing at Auburn. We were in Auburn at Auburn University last week. And in that community, people were saying the same thing about making those kinds of choices, especially seniors are making those kinds of choices. And some of the students are making those kind of choices because they don't have the money to pay for these high bills that have come about as a result of fluctuations in our climate.